Alright, so we're back, of course, talking about some Final Fantasy VII Remake, and we are once again discussing the ending because, of course, we are. There's constantly things to talk about when it comes to the end. Even though it's been more than 2 years at this point, there's always kind of newer things to talk about, or things that I've at least not discussed on my channel. Pretty much all of Chapter 18 is, like, constantly discussion-worthy. Like, the whole entire chapter, there's almost always something to talk about. Today, we're discussing multiple timelines again. It's actually been quite a bit since we've talked about that. But also, we're discussing the other Midgar. And at least in this case, we're discussing potentially the third Midgar, which is something I've never talked about. And what I mean by that is that when it comes to Remake, there's definitely two different Midgars that are very similar in design, but also distinctly different in certain ways. We have the regular just Remake Midgar that you see at the beginning of the game. And then you have this Midgar, which is inside the Singularity, and it's very similar to Remake Midgar's design, but there's one distinct difference, and it's on the outside of like the ring or the wall of Midgar, where they're kind of building outwards plate side. There's really not any structures, or very little, if any at all. Whereas if you hop back to the Remake design, there's very clearly a shit ton of structures built outside the walls of Midgar plateside, right? Whether that's overpopulation or whatever the case, just if they're just wanting to expand in general, like there's just so many buildings and structures on those additional plates. And what makes the conversation even more interesting is the Midgar that you're seeing inside the Singularity, where it's missing the buildings on the outside plates, is actually what the original Midgar looks like in the original FF7. So in that regard, we have like 2 or 3 different Midgars, right? We have the Remake design, the original FF7 design, and then you have the one inside the Singularity that's kind of a mixture of Remake's design, where like the inner city part is all just like Remake, but then you have the outskirts where it's reminiscent of OG FF7. Now, all this that we're talking about right here isn't exactly new. This stuff we've been talking about for almost 2 years now. I did this video in December of 2020, so that video is almost 2 years old at this point, so that's nothing new. Now, the actual third Midgar that I mentioned earlier in the video isn't the OG FF7 one. It's actually the Midgar that you see during Zack's scene at the end of the game. Now, with the initial reveal of Zack, you can't actually really make out Midgar. You kind of see the Shinra building in the distance, but that's it. Most of Midgar's covered up by the Whisper Dome. It's not until we've defeated the Whisper Harbinger and the explosion happens for Zack and launches him, and you see all the gold particles fall from the sky, that you get a good view of this Midgar. Now, the look we get at that Midgar is very quick, very brief, so I wouldn't blame somebody if, even though it's been more than 2 years at this point, if you never noticed that there is a distinct difference in the way that Midgar looks versus actually all the other Midgars. FF7 original, Singularity Midgar, and Remake Midgar, there's a very distinct difference. And it's actually a kind of weird thing, but it's definitely interesting and worth discussing. But before we continue, I do want to shout out nzivvo over on the Remake subreddit. For one of their older posts is why we did that video, almost 2 years ago with the 2 different Midgars. But what we're looking at today, and why we're talking about this today, is because of a recent post they did over on Reddit. So right here we have Zack's Midgar, and what people usually refer to this as is Terrier Midgar, because obviously the Terrier stamp logo, so people refer to this as Terrier Timeline, so Terrier Midgar is what people usually eloquently call this. Now, the difference between this Midgar versus every other Midgar that we've ever seen that you might not notice right away is where the Mako reactors are on the outside of the walls is squared off and flat, versus every other Midgar we've ever seen, they're rounded. So right here we have a Remake reactor, clearly it's rounded off. We don't actually get a look at what the outside of the reactors look like for the Singularity Midgar, but presumably it'd be similar to Remake, but they could also maybe be squared off, I don't know. And then here we have a Mach reactor from FF7 Original. I even took a picture of the exact same one Mach Reactor 5 to show you that it's clearly rounded off as well. And here we have a zoomed in image of Zack's Midgar that nzivvo provided us, and you can see that the shadow being cast by this reactor wall is clearly like squared off. It's like a right angle, right? Now, I don't think you necessarily needed this because you can just see that these reactor walls are squared off. If you look to the reactor to the very far right of this image, you can clearly see that it's squared off as well. Now, here we have a side-by-side for the Remake reactors versus Zack's Midgar's reactors. For one, they look very different, right? The tops are still rounded in Zack's Midgar, but obviously they have this like concrete barricaded walls, whatever they are. And Remake's reactors don't even have that. Like where you see like the 0505 on Remake, that'd be covered up by these like walls or whatever they are for Zack's Midgar. Now, the tops of the reactors where things also get even more interesting, they are still rounded in both Midgars, but they're very distinctly different. For one, Zack's Midgar, you can see that there's space between like the segments, I guess you'd call it. You can see the darkness between them, shadows, whatever it is, whereas Remake's Midgar, it's not like that. Now, there's been 2 relatively common theories when it comes to Remake for quite a while now. It's either that there's multiple timelines, usually about 2, or that we came out of the Singularity into an altered timeline, right? And I've never been married to any one of these ideas. I will say, however, for the longest time now that I can remember, at least like half a year or more, whatever it's been, I've leaned more in the camp of us coming out into an alternate timeline as opposed to there being multiple timelines. Now, on the topic of multiple timelines or multiple Midgars, there are people out there that just kind of write this off as like an impossibility for some reason. Like, there's no way they're telling that story. And it's like, for one, we don't know. Until we have further confirmation with the sequels, we don't know what they're doing. There could be multiple timelines, or there could just be one altered timeline. We don't have proof of anything just yet. But secondly, later on, after the Singularity shit at the Edge of Creation with Sephiroth, we know for a fucking fact that there are multiple universes. There's a universe of death that Sephiroth is looking at, and then behind Cloud is the universe of creation. Now, the universe of death that Sephiroth is looking at is supposed to be a universe that is close to being destroyed. Like, I think 7 seconds to the end is alluding to that, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is, putting that aside, that the universe is going to be destroyed soon, there's still objective fact of multiple universes. So why is it so impossible for multiple timelines? And on the topic of two Midgars, or at least multiple Midgars, I don't know why this seems like such an impossibility to people. For one, whenever we enter the Singularity and those tornadoes start attacking our group, we see them literally making copies of shit. We see the tornado pass by a crane and it makes a copy of the crane, but the original crane is still there. And also, whenever the tornado is going over the highway, you see a piece of highway fly up into the sky, but the highway is still there on the ground, or whatever, for lack of a better term. And also, this tower that's shown after the crane is also being copied, or whatever the damn thing is. So we see within the Singularity on at least 3 occasions of shit being copied by something, whether it's the Harbinger, the Whispers, the Singularity itself, the planet, Sephiroth. I don't know who's doing it, but somebody's copying shit, right? We see that multiple times. So I don't know why people can just write off the idea of multiple Midgars. Like, we see... It's why I can't, like, have conversations about this shit with certain people, because they have, like, one-track minds, right? They can only think one way, and it's like, how can you see multiple universes at Edge of Creation and then think that it's impossible for multiple timelines? How can you see the Singularity copying shit and think it's impossible for there to be multiple Midgars? It's just strange to me. Now, hopping back to something I said earlier in the video, I mentioned that Zack's Midgar, or Terrier Midgar, doesn't look like any other Midgar we've seen up to this point, right? And that is true. Sort of, because the reason why we're here today is with nzivvo's Reddit post they did a couple days ago, there actually is another Midgar that matches Zack's Midgar. And it's a weird one. It's the Midgar that we see in The First Soldier. So here's an image they put out for the Plateside update where you could do the Battle Royale on top of Midgar as opposed to underneath it. But what stands out about that Mahaka reactor in the bottom left corner? For starters, you have the top of the reactor that is still rounded off, but there's a bunch of space between the pieces, right? Which is very similar to how Zack's reactors look in the Terrier timeline, Terrier, Midgar, whatever, versus the top of Remake's reactors where there's virtually no space between the pieces, and there's significantly more than them, right? They're a lot thinner versus the one you're seeing in First Soldier and also in Zack's timeline. They're a lot bigger pieces. There's less of them. The other glaringly obvious thing here is that the front of the reactor on the outside of the wall is clearly flat and squared off. It has some sort of casing around it. Again, just like Zack's Midgar. Now, when it comes to the First Soldier reactors, you do see numbers on the outside of the walls, which you can't really see with Zack's, but to be fair, Zack's Midgar is really, really far away. It's not a very high-quality asset. If we got close up to that Midgar, it's very possible that there could be numbers on the outside of those reactors. Now, when it comes to the First Soldier, there's obviously not a lot of story or lore, but there are a few things we know. For one, it's set 30 years in the past, and we know that they're trying to, make the First Soldier, thus the name. But we also know that when you're playing the game in the Battle Royale, fighting other players, you are in a simulation. You're in a simulated Midgar. You're not really running around sniping people in the head in Aerith's front yard. So now that we know that it's a virtual reality recreation of Midgar, we know that there are going to be some maybe liberties taken in terms of how they would design Midgar for this virtual reality, like Shinra in canon and lore, because it's not actually laid out like how Midgar is, right? That's why you're not really going from sector to sector. You're in kind of one big open area, but you have in Sector 5 Aerith's house or Elmira's house, etc., Don Corneo and all that shit. It's not actually laid out like how Midgar actually is laid out. Now, that's a virtual reality depiction of Midgar 30 years in the past. That's how they designed it back then for this virtual reality. So why is it that Zack, whenever his final stand is taking place just a couple months before FF7/FF7 Remake, why is it that Zack is staring down a Midgar that is designed very similarly to the Midgar that we see in a virtual reality 30 years ago? So what the hell does all this mean? What are the options here? For one, kind of a simple explanation could maybe be that First Soldier doesn't actually take place in like Remake or FF7's timeline. It's possible that First Soldier could be set in Terrier timeline, which would be kind of nice because then they can kind of do whatever they want if that is the case. And it doesn't really affect the FF7 story because it's not even our world or timeline. Who cares, right? This could explain why First Soldier and Zack's Midgar have very differently designed reactors and wall around the reactor that like the rest of the compilation just does not have, because they take place in a separate timeline that is different from FF7 Remake. This is probably like the easiest and most convenient way to explain it away, but I think that, at least for now, this is kind of the best explanation. The other possibility that nzivvo poses with the Reddit post is that, for one, the boxed off reactors is an old Midgar design, right? We know that kind of factually since it's in First Soldier, that's 30 years in the past. This is factually an older Midgar design. What if Zack wasn't necessarily saved in an alter timeline or a separate timeline, but really just sent maybe into the past? Maybe he survived, but the Whispers put him in a different part of time. As in, Zack and Cloud at the end of Remake are walking towards a Midgar that is 30 years in the past. This could potentially explain why there's no Aerith in the church whenever Zack gets there. If it is set in the past 30 years ago, Aerith isn't even born yet. This could also explain why the church is in such good condition. That's something people have been talking about since we got the integrated ending, how different the church looks inside versus Aerith, which is very much run down and destroyed. That could also maybe explain this like crazy cross situation we talk about forever, where for Zack there's that wooden cross that's there, and it's there in the rest of the FF7 compilation, but in Remake, as you're playing as Cloud, it's not there. But maybe it's not there because this is set in present time, Zack set in the past, whenever maybe the church was a little bit newer, and that cross was still up. And one thing we do got to mention and talk about is that, let's assume that Zack is in the past, like pretty far into the goddamn past. There are flowers there in the church whenever he opens the door, right? And usually that's associated with Aerith. But in the original FF7, and I don't know how the script differs in English versus Japanese, but Aerith talks about that the flowers grow there because it's a sacred place. As in, like, it not really has anything to do with her necessarily. Maybe the flowers have always grown there and she just takes care of them. One of the things people like to talk about when it comes to the ending segment we see with Zack in episode intermission is that the people in the church are there and crying and sad because of Aerith being dead in this altered timeline or whatever, right? Which sure is a possibility. My counter to that's always been, why would people that know Aerith enough to cry for her and mourn for her be standing on the fucking flowers that she takes care of? That doesn't make any sense. If they know who Aerith is enough to mourn her death, they would not be walking on the fucking flowers she takes care of. That doesn't make any goddamn sense. My usual explanation for this is that they're potentially people from a different sector, as in refugees from Sector 7 or maybe Sector 1 or something like that don't know that this is an important place, that it belongs to Aerith, that these flowers are sacred, whatever the case. Or, in the context of this video, this scene could be taking place in the past, before this is even considered a sacred place. Now, we've talked a lot in the past about the different stamp logos, right? And how the Terrier logo is potentially an older logo design, right? And the lore that we have for Stamp is that it was a mascot they used at the start of the Wutai War to kind of boost morale. The Wutai War happened in 1992, 15 years ago, right? 15 years prior to the events of FF7/Remake. But we're talking about the possibility of something that takes place maybe as far back as 30 years. So again, who's to say that the Terrier logo isn't an older logo? There's like 15 plus years of the Shinra company existing prior to the use of the Beagle logo. It's pretty safe to assume that they would have had an original design or mascot or something. It's no different than any other company going through mascot changes and logo changes as the years go on. It's perfectly normal. Now look, as much as we've sat here and talked about the possibility of like Zack and the Cloud that he's saving being stuck maybe 30 years in the past, I don't know if it's what I think is happening or if it's even what I want to happen. It's an interesting concept. You know, this like sort of fish out of water thing. See like the old version of Midgar be kind of cool. Zack would be looking around for Aerith and other people he knows, and they'd either not be born yet or they'd be very, very young. And you could do some cool shit with that. I just don't know how that would coincide with the remake story or how he would even affect the story going forward or get to the future timeline. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you do there. I think given some of the stuff that we talked about in this video and some of the evidence that we have, it's hard not to look at that and not at least think heavily that there's possibly more than one timeline. We have multiple universes. That is an inarguable fact, even if one's going to be destroyed very soon. We also have at least 3 different Midgar designs that we're seeing throughout Remake, and there are certain things in Remake that you can chalk up to some dev errors like skybox issues, etc. But the thing is, one of these differently designed Midgars we're also seeing in a spin-off game. We're seeing in First Soldier, the Zack Terrier World Midgar. There's got to be a purpose to it. It didn't just happen. You don't have these differently designed Midgars in multiple different games. There's a purpose. There's a reason. And then you, of course, have the differently designed stamp logos, which can be easily explained away if there's multiple timelines. Look, this is a pretty long video, much longer than most of the videos that we do. If there's one thing to take away from this video, it's that the Midgar that we're seeing during Zack's ending with Remake is different to the Midgar that we see throughout the rest of the game. It's different to the Singularity Midgar and regular Remake Midgar. It's different to even the original FF7's Midgar. But, for whatever reason, it's matching up with the Midgar that we're seeing in The First Soldier. Why is that? You tell me. What are your thoughts? I just want to know what your guys' thoughts are, because I have not discussed the Zack different Midgar at all. I kind of wanted a reason to discuss it outside of it just being visually different. But now that we're seeing it line up with a different Midgar finally, what the hell is the purpose? What is the point of that? Do you think it's Zack in the past? or just an alternate timeline where Midgar was designed differently and there's a different stamp logo. My dudes, that is going to finally be the video. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't new today. The more Final Fantasy VII Remake, ending, Zack, different Midgar's content. Turn on notifications. Follow me to _DYT. I'm a Discord. Links for social networks are in the description. And in the outro. Later, guys.
Almost there, Cloud. We're almost there.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.